Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Caroline Colas, and I am the Senior Director of Health and Wellness at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. And I am your host today on the Positive Psychology Hour, a series that we do in partnership with Whole Being Institute. Today, we're going to be discussing personal freedom and freedom in the world just in time for Passover with Rabbi Deborah Orenstein. Freedom is indispensable for human flourishing. Positive psychologists estimate that 40% of our happiness depends on intentional activities, with 50% related to genetic disposition and just 10% to external circumstances. In other words, happiness depends more on freedom of choice and less on outside factors than many of us may suppose. But freedom weighs even more heavily than those statistics indicate. A lack of freedom changes the odds. In societies where women are oppressed and in countries where political expression is neither free nor protected, people are far less satisfied with their lives. We need only think of Russia and Ukraine to feel this truth, and it's human toll. If we are not free, either because of internal or external factors, it becomes difficult to make choices that will help us flourish. Yet we all recognize that human beings have inalienable rights, spiritual freedom, that can defy and overcome any tyrant or oppression. So what we're going to discuss today is with Passover, the Jewish festival of freedom, as it arrives this month, and its lessons and inspiration to promote freedom for others and to increase it for ourselves. How do we do that? And how do we make meaning from this particular time of year? Rabbi Deborah Orenstein brings the meaning and relevance of the Jewish spiritual tradition to a diverse audience. Named by the Forward as one of America's most inspiring rabbis, she has been a keynote speaker at hundreds of venues, including houses of worship and interfaith conferences for both Christian and Jewish organizations. For 20 years, Rabbi Deborah taught at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and in 2016, she completed her certificate in positive psychology. Today, Rabbi Deborah is an instructor at the Academy for Jewish Religion in New York and the spiritual leader of Congregation B'nai Israel in Emerson, New Jersey, and connects directly with the public through online classes and her e-newsletter. I welcome to the call once again, Rabbi Deborah.
Thank you, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm often on these calls as often as I can be and looking at the recordings, and it's a pleasure to also be one of the teachers who returns. Going to begin just to reiterate the title and the direction of where we're going, your personal freedom and freedom in the world. And we'll spend some time on both of those, but most of our discussion will be on your personal freedom. When we talk about freedom, it's important to understand what we mean. And in Hebrew, as we'll see, there are many, many different ways to say freedom, and they connote different aspects of freedom. So the ancient rabbis talked about material freedoms, specifically physical freedom, starting first and foremost. When we think about Passover, that physical freedom is expressed in the song that we sing at the Passover Seder, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves, and now we're free. There was a physical oppression and limitation. And it also includes political freedom when we think about Passover. First of all, of course, Pharaoh was a tyrant who tried to control the Israelites for political gain. But also in the text of the Passover Seder, the Haggadah, the ancient rabbis drew an analogy between Pharaoh of old and the Roman Empire in their own day as an oppressive regime. And today we can think of modern day pharaohs. Naturally, first and foremost, Putin comes to mind. There are also spiritual freedoms, and these, of course, are not divorced from material freedoms, but it's helpful to think sometimes in terms of these categories, even though there aren't any neat divisions. And spiritual freedoms have to do, first of all, with the inalienable idea that we are all entitled to freedom because we are all created in the image of God. The minute you realize or come to believe that there is one God who is the creator of all, or as soon as you believe in a single source of life, whether that's evolution or being, even if you don't call it God, then you have to understand all people as equal and everyone as having the right to freedom. That's part of what our Passover Haggadah talks about as well. And we have an inner freedom, regardless of what is going on in outer circumstances. There's an inner freedom to choose what we'll focus on and to choose our response. As well, you can have everything going swimmingly in external circumstances, but feel constricted and not free on the inside. So inner freedom is its own independent category. And there is initiative as freedom, the power of choice as a divine expression. When we exercise our freedom, that's when we're really free. It's not just that freedom is granted to us, but that we initiate our own freedom as well. Now, we're going to be talking in more detail about all of these as I go through. And it's nothing to memorize, but you will get the PDF if you want it that outlines all of this. What I'd like to begin with is just a little snapshot of your own relationship to freedom. As I've been talking, is there one of these freedoms that leaps out to you? Or is there another kind of freedom that wasn't named here that's important to you? A different way of expressing what freedom is all about. So I'm going to ask you to put in the chat what aspect or definition or quality of freedom is most alive for you right now, or maybe is most needed right now. Either way, what are you feeling is important to know and express in the way of freedom?
Freedom to choose how to spend my time.
We're going to be talking about that time is a key element in freedom. The very definition of enslavement is someone whose time is not their own.
Inner freedom, spiritual freedom.
That's where we're going to be putting most of our emphasis today, though we will cover the others. As I said, they're all really and truly interwoven because personal and political freedom are connected. Inner freedom is influencing of and influenced by outer freedom.
Choices, boundaries, I am enough. Deirdre says, to be. Elizabeth, freedom of values, pressure from family is what's most, it's what's up right now. Susan says, freedom to express feelings. Your mention of internal freedom really resonates with me. Thank you so much, says Diana. Freedom from physical ailments, illness, hijacking my choices.
So yes, Caroline is the expert to read about physical freedom and increasing our freedom in our physical bodies in order to be more free in every way. Yes, so much good wisdom there. And I hope you'll keep all those things in mind as we continue. I want to acknowledge that we have all these layers of freedom, the idea that we all need all these forms of freedom. And what's remarkable is how much freedom is the essential story of the Jewish people. It's not just on Passover that we tell the story. We tell this story every day in our daily prayers when we talk about the crossing of the sea. The story of the Exodus is the foundational narrative of the Jewish people. It's where our history begins. It's when our calendar begins. And the most frequently repeated commandment in the Bible is, remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and so on. In the Talmud, there's actually a debate as to the number of times that various iterations of this commandment are repeated. The number of times is anywhere from 36 to 54, but by far it's the reason given the most for why we do what we do, and it's the most repeated instruction. Do not oppress the stranger, care for the stranger, protect the stranger, love the stranger, for you were a stranger in the land of Egypt, and you know the soul of a stranger. So let's talk about physical freedoms briefly, and I'm going to be introducing some of the Hebrew terminology. It's nothing for anybody to memorize, but it may give you some new ways of thinking about freedom. In the book of the Exodus, Yetziah is exiting, and it implies removal from danger. And here you see the classic scene of the Jewish people escaping the Egyptian army with walls of water on both sides. They removed themselves from danger by proceeding through the water on dry land. And this is not something just from the past, but there are people who need to be removed from danger right now. By the estimates of the International Labor Organization, there are 42 million people enslaved around the world today. And we're going to be talking about them. Many of them in labor trafficking, a minority in sex trafficking. Most are women, a high percentage of young people, and including also forced marriage. There's rescue from oppression that happens, that the Israelites were under the thumb of their taskmasters. They had hard, difficult labors. And again, still today, there is rescue from oppression. There are people who are no longer slaves per se, but they still need to be rescued from oppression. In the United States, about 15 years ago in Immokalee, Florida, there were slaves who were literally chained down when they were not picking tomatoes in the United States of America. Today, they have been freed, largely in thanks to the efforts of clergy and TRUA, including Rabbis for Human Rights, a couple of very important organizations that worked on this. And maybe you even saw people putting a tomato on their Seder plate for a while, or maybe you still do it to acknowledge that there were people who were enslaved. But now they're no longer in slavery, yet they don't make a living wage, yet they don't have equal rights. So there's still work to do. The Bible talks about liberty, and in fact, a quote from the Bible is on the Liberty Bell: "Proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof." And in the context of Leviticus, this is referring to economic equity. The process of having a Jubilee year every 50th year in the Bible meant a reset so that no one could fall into generational poverty. And so liberty is the liberty of being able to sustain yourself and to have dignity. There is also a biblical concept of Shemitah, release. And this has to do with the Sabbath, because the Shemitah year, the year of release, is the 7th year. Just as we work for 6 days traditionally and rest on the 7th, they worked for 6 years and had an entire sabbatical year when the land was allowed to lie fallow, when people were free to collect any fruit or vegetable or other produce from the land that grew, and they could go into one another's what used to be private property. Everything was open. And they would also use this time for communal ventures, for study, for rejuvenation, for rest. And we talked about time as being instrumental to freedom. A day of rest, or in their case, in the ancient world, even a whole year of rest, was instrumental to freedom. And in the imagery of traditional Judaism, when you have a Sabbath day each week, it's like you're royalty in your own house, because free people can take that rest. And it's an exercise of your freedom to do so. It also, of course, stokes your ability to act freely when you are well rested. I want to share with you this 4-minute video, and we'll talk about it on the other side. I think it's very, very powerful. I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I do.
बड़ी परेशानी बड़ी दुर्गत थी मधुबारा भी मैंने तब के मारतो फिरतो रहल साहेब त मैंने के सुनक पाई हम हनों के गोल में कर आदमी मर गए ना ये खर्चा 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 मार मार
The nature of Brooklyn is such that people who are working there are entirely in slavery. And the reason for this is that this whole industry is controlled by violence and threat.
हमारा पिता मेरे भाई के थोक के चटौला ऑफिस में बंद थे साहब वही डर के मिले हमने वहाँ से चले 4-5 साल काम वहाँ कर रहे हैं 4 महीना के 5 महीना थे वो तो हम लोग नहीं भागे थे बाकी हमारी पत्नी का ढेर बहुत हालत खराब हो गया था सीरियस हो गया था वो तो पैसा मांगे नहीं मिला फिर गाड़ी आए सब मारे पिटे
This is all illegal. They probably know, but they don't have the courage to come out of it. Until MSCMBS field workers reach to them. And that is the time when they start realizing how they can change their situation.
MSCMBS basically believes in rescue, rehabilitation, and reintegration, along with the prevention, prosecution, and conviction of the slaveholders and traffickers. It creates community vigilance committees in the vulnerable communities. During the Community Vigilance Committee, most of the survivors and the community members discuss about their basic issues, their local agenda, the kind of cases they have been reported. This Kuklaha CVC identified many cases of slavery in victims themselves. Kuklaha CVC has rescued more than 1,000 people till date. And this all was possible because of their belief that they can achieve self-sustained liberation, which is ultimately the model of MSCMBS.
The whole approach of these slaves and the partners is not to just free them, but to sustain the freedom. We do not give any high dreams or big dreams to the communities who are freed because we want them to have those dreams and then realize them. And the CVC in the village wanted to realize their dream of being an owner of their own brick mill. And they came up with idea together. They started from one brick.
बहुत अंतर है बहुत अंतर है कि तो घर का बात है ना घर के मामले में लोग काम कर रहे हैं जमकर सोच रहे हैं कि बाल बच्चे की भी सुखी तरह से हम लोग अब से निकल के सुख से तो आगे भी चल के सुख से रह जाए हम लोग को बहुत अच्छा लगा था मतलब और 2-4 लोग के लिए आँखें कटा लेते और अच्छा लगे
हम लोग के माने यही रखता है कि हम लोग ये राम जानकी जैसे वो लोग जोड़े हैं जैसे जोड़ी पर सब पात रहे थे
मकान बनावे ले अपन कर खा दे
सर इसलिए हम लोग कहीं से आगे बढ़े
हमारे बदे ईटा का मतलब बहुत आजाद बा
So I'm going to invite anybody who might like to unmute and just share some reactions of what you saw, what kind of freedom was displayed there, what it evoked in you when you watched it. Any thoughts, any reactions?
I
Where
was just
was
thinking-
that?
That was India,
Yeah,
and
that's what I
it
thought.
was from 2014.
Thank you.
I was struck by how the symbol that had been one of oppression became a symbol of freedom, very much like the matzah. And other things that you could, that it's not, the symbol has no inherent significance until you imbue it with such. And now these bricks remind us, that last speaker, of freedom. I thought that was really beautiful.
When you were talking about slavery, when we were watching that video, I immediately thought about incarcerated people that are basically enslaved, working for slave wages to be able to buy basic supplies to live in jail.
Thank you for that. That's a modern expression of slavery, mass incarceration, and people in solitary confinement, even for years at a time, cruel punishments, and work on their behalf is a form of redeeming the captives.
It's a wonderful film and a wonderful story with a wonderful message. But put in context, I think you had said earlier that there were about 40 million people in slavery in the world over that. Was that correct?
Yes.
So I find that number just horrifying. And I had certainly heard that there were millions before. I didn't know that. I find it sort of overwhelming when you start thinking about that.
I'm with you, but the good news is there's a lot that can be done. And as you see, even influencing a whole community is possible. And what's remarkable, it was hinted at here, and it's explained in more detail in a lot of other resources, is that this group that was freed now become themselves advocates for freedom, and they go to other villages and they bring in more people into freedom. They're making the bricks, and that's a great transition. I'm going to show you our ancient ancestors also made bricks, if you'll recall, and they made bricks from mud. And so were these people making bricks out of mud. And initially they did it in slavery, but then they did it in freedom. They elected to do it in freedom. And what's remarkable to me is, the physical conditions are not great later on either. They're in the hot sun. They don't seem to have a ton of possessions, or certainly their clothes are not fancy, but the smiles on their faces tell you that they're in a very different position. And I love that little moment where one of the women takes some of the mud that will make the brick and sticks it on the head of a little boy playfully, and they're engaging with each other. Bricks are the reason that we eat charoset on the top right on your screen. And on the bottom left is a town called Ramses in Egypt. The Bible tells us was built by our people, slaves in the 13th century BCE, out of mud bricks, just like people today. So I'm with Deborah. It's overwhelming that in the 13th century BC, people were enslaved to make bricks, and still today, people are enslaved to make bricks. But we are just the people to end that cycle. And in the chat and here up on the screen, and I'll share it with you again at the end, there are all sorts of actions that you can take at the website freetheslaves.net/Judaism, resources for your Seder, opportunities to give, ways to involve your synagogue or school, if you're part of a synagogue or school, in helping to free today's slaves. So we've talked a lot about physical freedom. I want to make sure that we also talk about these other freedoms. In the Bible, the word for both physical and political freedom is chofshiyut, chofshi. And if you know the Israeli national anthem, it uses that word to be a free people in our own land. We may have once taken political freedom for granted, but today with Ukraine, after the January 6th riots, for all sorts of reasons, we really can't and mustn't take it for granted. There is the concept of shalicha, sending people away, allowing for free movement. Pharaoh initially wanted to keep the Israelites in Egypt, didn't want to let them go. Certainly we see humanitarian corridors being blocked today. We know that there wasn't free migration at the time of the Second World War or for Soviet Jewry. And this leads to deep, deep losses of freedom. There is a concept of redeeming the captives that particularly, but not only, relates to political prisoners. And you can see, some of you may remember personally, the marches for Soviet Jewry when people were sent to gulags for wanting to practice their Judaism or for wanting to immigrate to Israel from the Soviet Union. And because of mass protests and remembering prisoners of conscience and demanding, let my people go, echoing the words of Exodus, eventually the Iron Curtain came down. And in our own time, we still see captives who need to be freed. Navalny in Russia, Gilad Shalit was an Israeli soldier who captured the imagination of the world. And likewise, the girls, some of whom were released by Boko Haram, but many of whom are still not free. So I want to just ask you to think about what you might add to the Seder plate this year because of what we've talked about of physical and political freedom. And I'll give you a couple of ideas. Some people are adding a sunflower to represent Ukraine. Some people are adding a padlock to represent modern slavery. And those things sitting on your Seder plate will spark discussion, which is exactly what we're meant to do, is to do things a little differently, dip, lean, eat different foods in order to raise questions at the Seders. Now, my sister mentioned that matzah has two opposite meanings. You could say the same for the sunflower. The sunflower is bright and shiny and sunny, reminding us of the produce and the beauty of Ukraine. It also reminds us that Ukraine is under siege. The padlock, when it's closed, reminds us of slavery and the millions of people who are in need. And when we open it, it gives us a sense of empowerment and that freedom is possible. And we can remember how people are being freed now and how we can do more to free more people quickly. One note of encouragement for Deborah and all of us: the United Nations, the Catholic Church, and the conservative movement of Judaism have all committed to end human trafficking entirely by the year 2030. That's not very far into the future. So there are proven methods of getting there. It's really a matter of will and of funding. Now I want to get to what I think is maybe the most meaningful part of freedom to talk about together, and that's the inalienable freedom, the spiritual freedom that is always a part of us. I mentioned Ukraine, of course, and while Zelensky is under death threats and while his family are under death threats, he exudes and beams out a kind of redemptive spiritual freedom. There is nothing Putin can do to him, not even threatening him with death, not even killing him, that will kill the spirit of freedom. And the same was true for Natan Sharansky when he was captured and held in prison for years on end. In fact, he elected to stay in prison rather than be freed with a false confession, because his spiritual freedom was more important to him than his physical freedom. All human beings are inherently children of liberty, B'nai Chorin. This is a prayer that we say each morning. Thank you, God, for creating me free. I'm a ben chorin, a bat chorin. I am a child of freedom because a child of God. And this word chor means whole, and it is related to the modern Hebrew word for chirut, freedom, the word that's used the most often. And it literally means to engrave, like the tablets that Moses received were engraved. And engraving leaves a hole, leaves a negative space. And it comes to mean freedom because freedom is engraved and ingrained in us. It's that inalienable, it's indelible, it's part of us. But also there is a notion that freedom, it requires space. A hole, that negative space, represents freedom. If everything is full to the brim in your schedule, you don't feel free. If everyone else's demands of you are crowding out your own sense of what is right, you're not free. So that's a contemplation for now, and also to hopefully bring to your Seders what freedoms are permanently etched in you and what is full to the brim in your life where more empty space could mean more freedom. It might even mean something like letting go of a grudge to give yourself more inner freedom. There's a beautiful poem about this idea of space and emptiness as freedom. As a bird soars high in the free holding of the wind, clear of the certainty of the ground, opening the imagination of wind, into the grace of emptiness, may your life awaken to the call of its freedom. One of the collections of essays by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel is entitled The Insecurity of Freedom. Freedom doesn't always put your feet under you. It doesn't always give you certainty of the ground. There's an empty space. There's a void into which you move when you're free. And that's a beautiful void sometimes. It's a necessary place to dwell before you make choices. Inner freedom is another expression of spiritual freedom. And related to this idea of space and a whole, chorin, is the very word for Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, which means double narrowness. And if you look at the picture of the Nile, this is a photograph of the Nile River, you'll see there's blue in the center, kind of a winding river, and green on either side that almost looks like it's a continuation of the river. But actually that green is fertile land. Because the Nile River feeds the land, there is great fertility in these two narrow strips on either side of the Nile, and that's where Egypt gets its Hebrew name from, narrow strips. But more than just being the physical terrain of narrow strips, Egypt was a place of narrowness and constriction. And that's what the lack of freedom feels like. It feels like you're being squeezed, literally oppressed. Whereas freedom feels like breath and spaciousness. And we feel that even in our bodies. This is where spiritual and physical don't go into separate or neat categories, as I mentioned. But your inner space of your mind, your heart, having a sense that there is room in there and time in there, that is freedom, as is space and time on the outside to control your destiny. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz wrote on becoming free, and he said, between ceasing to be a slave and acquiring freedom, the individual must pass through an intermediate stage in his progress, without which he cannot become truly free. He must develop inner qualities of his own. Meaning, it's not a binary of I used to be a slave and now I'm completely free. But there is a process by which we all continually become more free. Every one of us has an inner Pharaoh, an inner taskmaster. Every one of us is constricted internally in some way. So on the way from slavery, which thankfully all of us have been spared from on a physical, external level, we go through this intermediate lifelong process of refining our freedom, expanding our freedom. And it has to do with what your inner life is like. We all have within us the choice of where to put our focus and the choice of how to respond to external circumstance. That is a constant freedom that is always with us, no matter what's going on externally. And maybe you read this in Man's Search for Meaning. It bears repeating always because of its beauty and its depth. We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This awareness that it really is up to us, that no one is making us respond in a certain way or making us feel a certain way, is the power of choice and the power of freedom. The Bible talks about this most famously in Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth to witness this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life in order that you and your descendants may live. So even when you don't have control over literal life and death, for example, Zelensky, you do have control over your response to that. And will you spiritually choose life? Will you go toward what is most life affirming, what is most creative, what is most vital instead of what is destructive or going to doom you. That's always a choice. And it is a powerful contemplation to consider that every choice you make is inclining you one way or the other. There is no neutral ground. We're either moving toward more freedom or less. We're either choosing life or de facto, we're choosing destruction. So here is the meta choice that I want to point out. It's a choice to notice that you have a choice. It's a choice to notice that there are possibilities. And I think there are other very important meta choices to consider. I want to share a few of them with you. I'm thinking about my mom is on this call today, and she set a great example with my father. They made a meta choice, a global choice, to say that if there was a family celebration that they could possibly attend, even if it was inconvenient, even if it required a plane ride, they were going to go. And they made that a default, a meta choice in life, because that inclined them toward life. They said, we know we'll show up for the funerals. Every family meets at the funerals, but we don't just want to meet at the funerals. So that was a meta choice that they made. Another meta choice you can make is, for example, to always choose the freedom of Sabbath rest. Friday night, no matter what else is going on, I'm going to light the candles. I'm going to have Shabbat. It's a wonderful book by Tiffany Schlein called 24/6. And the subtitle is The Power of Unplugging One Day a Week. SHLAIN, if you want to look it up. And so she talks about that, creating a meta choice around Sabbath rest. Or one of my favorite choices is I made a choice years ago to assume goodwill. If I feel offended by something or I think something is wrong, I'm going to assume that there was goodwill but an error or goodwill but a misunderstanding rather than running in and assuming bad will. And that goes back to the Mishnah. That's an instruction from our religious tradition.
Come from love. Elaine says, exercise every day.
Yes,
Deirdre
you don't
Rose
have to
says,
get up and think about it. Am I going to do it?
right.
It
I
just-
decided to be
easier.
happy by default from a very young age, says Deirdre Rose. I decided to be happy by default from a very young age.
A lot of times we make negative meta choices without realizing it. And we make a lot of unconscious meta choices for good and for ill. So just making it conscious and realizing, oh, I guess I have made a choice about this, but it's become transparent to you and it just seems like that's the way it is because you didn't identify it as a choice.
When faced with a choice, try the thing that will give me the most experiences. Choose to love myself, less judgment, acceptance of swamp and the pond. Call out racism as I encounter it.
So that last one is a great example of something very in detail in the granular. So if you're caught in that moment of somebody says something that horrifies you and you sort of say to yourself, I don't know what to do. How do I respond? What should I do? If you've made that meta choice in advance, that does take away one layer of difficulty and uncertainty in how you'll respond.
And Elaine says, waking up and saying, thank you, God. And I have a choice where it's only one jerk allowed in the room at a time. So if somebody's behaving like a jerk, then I don't get to.
I love it. That's a fantastic one. So many of these are just gorgeous and worthy of adoption.
Choose self-compassion, try to understand versus being set on being understood. Ooh, that's a nice one.
So here's another nitty gritty that my sister shared with me. She said, whenever someone asks her for money as a fundraiser, if it's a personal ask, she always gives something. It's never, I wonder if I'll give, it's a little bit like, hey, if they come by and they're selling the Girl Scout cookies, I'm always going to say yes. You're going to support those kinds of things. It could be your meta choice, or maybe you'll make a different meta choice, but just thinking about it that way, I hope is helpful.
Deborah says, years ago, when my parents had some health issues, I decided to call my parents every day, and it has been wonderful in terms of building the relationship over the years. When COVID hit, I started calling my aunt also on a daily basis as she was isolated in her independent living facility. And again, it has been great.
Oh, wow. How beautiful. Thank you for those. So I want to talk a little bit about initiative as an exercise of spiritual freedom. Rabbi Dean Steinsaltz says, slavery is that condition in which a person is always subject to the will of another. And that seems like a good basic definition. But then he hits you with something a little bit surprising. Freedom, on the other hand, is the ability to act upon and carry out one's own independent will. So, in other words, to the extent that you don't have the internal discipline or compassion that will allow you to act on your own will, you're not free. And that's a powerful idea. He goes on to say, we must bring ourselves to ever more deeply understand that we shall be truly redeemed only when we take it upon ourselves to fulfill our need to live in our own unique way. That is when we become truly free. So your own independent will, what you choose in your meta choices, and I heard several that I intend to adopt, but whatever you choose, that is going to help make you really and truly free when you follow through on it and when you take the initiative to help make it happen. And I want to point out that this idea of taking initiative is ensconced, it's included in the Exodus story, because it's at the time of the plagues that Moses first talks to the people about their freedom. It's not once they cross over to the other side or once they're standing at Mount Sinai, but while they're still in Egypt, that Moses and Aaron say to the people, it's time to count time according to the Jewish calendar. This month shall be for you the beginning of months, because the beginning of the month, 15 days before the Exodus, after the plague of darkness and before the final plague of the slaying of the firstborn, Moses is saying your freedom begins now. Not when the external circumstances are there, but when you initiate it inside yourself. And that's why the word for you is repeated twice here, because you have to declare it. Even in biblical understanding and certainly rabbinic understanding, it is the people who witness and declare the new moon in the sky that marks the beginning of the Hebrew month. And the moon will grow and grow. And by the time of Passover, you'll see a full moon in the sky. But the very beginning of freedom is at the time of the first moon, while they're still enslaved. And there's a lot of discussion at that point about gathering together with community to have a Seder. They're not free yet. It's not the anniversary of their freedom. Before they are free, they get together, they have a meal, they talk about it. They get together in large groups. The whole people hears about the calendar. They get together with family groups and with sections of tribes and one-on-one, each person with a neighbor. And in all these different iterations of community, they together find freedom. The idea of initiating freedom is especially powerful when they paint the doorposts with the blood of the lamb that they sacrifice. This is a way of marking your house. Rebels live here. Pharaoh, come and get me. And by taking an active role, by doing it themselves, they're initiating their own freedom. Earlier plagues fell upon Egypt. In the case of locusts, literally, they fell from the sky. But here they're making freedom happen. They're taking the initiative, as we all have to do. We all have to participate in our own freedom. And before they're free, they're eating the bitter herbs, because the process of becoming free is not all sunshine and rainbows and sweets. It also has sometimes difficulties and bitter things to go through in order to be free. And they have this Passover Seder style meal with a sense of urgency, with their loins girded, with their sandals on their feet, with their walking stick in their hand, eating it hurriedly, knowing my freedom depends on this moment. That's quite a way to think about exercising and initiating your freedom. And then the Bible tells us that at that point, after they've done their part, that's when the miracle flows in. That's when God steps in. And so often that's my experience, that when we do our part, then God will come in and do the part that we can't do. There's a couple of ideas that I want to highlight here and that we'll talk about in the remainder of our time that come out of this reading from Exodus chapter 12. The first is that we have to celebrate freedom even before it happens, if it's going to happen fully. Remember, Adine Steinsaltz said freedom is a process. It is a lifetime engagement. If you waited to be fully free to celebrate, you'd never celebrate. It's only a taskmaster who would tell you, wait until you're completely free, then you're allowed to celebrate. We have to celebrate every little aspect of freedom that we gain, every little aspect of freedom that we're able to help another person gain. And then community. They didn't do that Exodus alone. They did it with each other. They didn't do that meal alone. They did it with one another. And while freedom is a birthright, it will require action and risk by individuals and by groups. There's a beautiful poem by David Whyte that speaks to this early moment of initiating action on the part of freedom when there was just a sliver of the moon of the new month in the sky. Sometimes everything has to be inscribed across the heavens so that you can find the one line already written inside you. That brings the external miracles together with the internal miracle of freedom. Sometimes it takes a great sky to find that first bright and indescribable wedge of freedom in your own heart. I love how the word wedge of freedom is right on that wedge of the moon, that sliver of the moon that you can see at the start of the month as we bring in the month of Nisan and Passover. So this is a beautiful concept that freedom is not just freedom from oppression. It's not just the physical freedom from all the things that weigh us down, or the spiritual freedom from inner Pharaoh's bad self-talk. It's also freedom too. What will you use your freedom for? What will you initiate because you're free? So I want to spend some time celebrating and savoring some of the different kinds of freedom that we've been talking about. As Passover approaches, all the various forms of freedom that we talked about are evident. We were removed from danger when we were taken out of Egypt. We were rescued. We were redeemed. We were spared being chased down by Pharaoh's army. We were assisted through signs and wonders and miracles. We were reminded of our own agency and told to paint the doorposts and to have the Seder, as it were. And we were elevated again as royal creations in God's image. We were not just beasts of burden anymore, but we had the power to create our own opportunities, to create our own freedom. That's true in the 13th century BCE as we look over the Passover story, and we can celebrate and honor the bravery of our ancestors. But it's also true for each of us today, I think. I'm sure you can think of a moment when you were removed from danger, whether it was someone helping you out of an addiction or being saved from a car accident or a bad relationship that would have dragged you down. There's so many times when we have happily, blessedly had community step in, had other helpers step in and remove us from danger. And there are times when we were participated in that and extricated ourselves. We've been rescued, we've been redeemed, we've been spared. I hope you can think of some miracles in your life that helped you to be more free. Just the miracle that you or your ancestors immigrated to this country has enabled your freedom. And when we think about freedom in this way, it's important and good to think about the alternative. What if we didn't savor freedom? What if we just let it pass us by? I love this quote from Thomas Merton. Superficial freedom to wander aimlessly here or there, to taste this or that, to make a choice of distractions is simply a sham. It claims to be a freedom of choice when it has evaded the basic task of discovering who it is that chooses. So I put up some examples of the sham. Look at your cell phone, as it could be something you add to your Seder plate as a symbol of freedom. All the world is at my disposal. I can look up any fact. I can FaceTime with a distant relative. And it's a symbol of your slavery if you let it be. If you are just chained to your phone and always have to respond and or a slave to your inbox and so on. We can overindulge in any kind of appetite. We can objectify ourselves or others. We can become acquisitive in the way that the advertising industry sometimes coaxes us to be. And it seems like, oh, I'm choosing the brand new sports car. I'm choosing this fantastic meal. I'm choosing to use my cell phone. But really, it's a fake choice. It's a sham. And the true choice is to decide who is it that is choosing? Who am I? And what constitutes my true freedom? When we have an awareness of our freedom, an awareness of bechira, the option of choosing, when we can make the meta choice to always realize that we have a choice, then that can be a source of awe. I spoke about awe about 6 months ago, and I think there's a lot of awe to be had for our freedom. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. It really is amazing the degree of power that we have to choose, that we live in a land and in a time of history where, as a Jew, as a woman, I am free to do so much of what my ancestors could not have done. And I have witnessed my own ability to choose anew and to substitute one thought for another, to use positive psychology to lift myself up and to make myself more free. I hope you've experienced that too. I know everyone here is familiar with the SPIRE acronym. We've heard it many times in these positive psychology hours. And I'm just going to review it. I like to add an A at the beginning. Aspire. First of all, I like the word aspire. But also because in the same way that Martin Seligman added achievement to his PERMA acronym, I like to add aspiration. I like to think about not just what is now, but what could be. So let's apply this to freedom and consider, what are our aspirations for freedom? What kind of spiritual freedom speaks to you? Maybe initiative, maybe the inner freedom, maybe inalienable freedom, just sitting with the awareness that you are free by birth. There's a physical freedom, whether we're thinking about incarcerated people or slaves today, or people who are in abusive relationships, or whether we're thinking about people who are trapped in ALS or in other diseases that don't allow them to move, or even small amounts of physical discomfort or pain can constrict us. How do we have, and how do we aspire for more physical freedom? Intellectual freedom. What do you want to learn? What do you want to explore? Where do you want to allow your mind to go that maybe before you said, oh, that's not for me, but now maybe you can. There's relational freedom to truly be yourself and to give people the space to be themselves, to allow extra room for expression and for compassion. And there's emotional freedom. Having a sense that you feel spacious and liberated inside, that you're not driven by one emotion or another, or one reaction or another, but you can actively take a choice. So I want to encourage everyone to pick one of these freedoms that especially means something to you and just write it in the chat. If it's, you could just write the word spiritual, or you might write what spiritual freedom is speaking to you. You could write the word relational. You might say, it's my relationship with my brother-in-law that I want to bring freedom to.
If we truly believe in freedom, then why don't all Jews believe in the freedom for the LGBT community? And I think for me, when I see all Jews, right, I'm struck by why don't all people, right? And you know, the diversity that we have in our world, in our community, about who is free and who isn't.
It's a fair and a good question. I think that when you're looking at this through the lens of freedom, when you're looking at that question through the lens of freedom, then the question answers itself. But maybe the answer is that people are not looking at it through the lens of freedom, and that's the problem. If they looked at it through the lens of we are all created equally in the image of God and we're all created free, maybe then all people would agree. But that's an aspiration. That goes under my A for aspiration. Thank you for that comment.
And there was another comment, we can choose to change our habits and spiritual freedom via meditation.
Yes, beautiful. I think that, yeah, taking the time to allow for inner spaciousness through mindfulness meditation is one of the great ways to expand your spiritual freedom. Absolutely.
So Deborah, to close, Rabbi Deborah Ornstein, this Passover in particular, what is setting you free?
You're really asking me the question I was about to ask. How will you use your personal and political freedom? What initiative will you take? Because I think that Passover time, as much as we celebrate the freedom that came to us because of the good works of the midwives and Pharaoh's daughter and Moses and Aaron and Miriam, and of course, most of all, God, we're also being challenged to say, where will I exercise my freedom? It's not just about what I've been granted, but what I can do. And so I think my source of freedom this Passover resides in making a difference for slaves today. That's my passion, and I believe I can do that. That's part of the reason I'm speaking so widely here and at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. And I spoke in Milwaukee, and I've been a scholar in residence speaking about freetheslaves.net/Judaism, letting people know how they can donate, helping to free those slaves. If even one person talks about this at their Seder or gives a donation based on having been here today, I will feel that my intention for freedom was fulfilled this Passover.
Amazing. Just thank you so much, Rabbi Deborah Ornstein, for joining us today and for this insight on freedom. I was taking pictures and sending them to my supervisors about your presentation, and they were saying, what a lovely message. This is so important and so relevant. So I really thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us and aspiring us to think of Passover in a different way.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to everyone for your participation and your ideas. I wish you a very happy and liberating Passover.
Take care.
Thank you.
Hello.